Many of us are currently in a kind of state of emergency. It's a very exciting state because on one hand, we have a lot of strength for ourselves, for implementation, and for breakthroughs. On the other hand, these topics shake us up quite a bit and ultimately bring about a state of being that is not easy to achieve, but in the end, it is a state of being that is optimal for the new times, for the new earth, so that we can all create entirely new reality structures together. First of all, my name is Linda Giese. I have been a spiritual mentor for over 20 years, the author of the book Consciousness Next Level, and the founder of the Being Potential Method. Being potentials are your being potentials, your strengths, your intrinsic motivators, your compass in life, so that you can truly become the being you are meant to be and also lead a really good, powerful, self-determined, happy life. If you want to know more about it, feel free to join our next live show, which is completely free. You can find the link in the show notes. So, what intense vibrations are we experiencing right now? They are indeed very strong and they are shaking something loose within us. And shaking things free means that not only are our beliefs being broken open, that our previously perceived history is being put on completely new footing, but also our spiritual concepts or upbringing concepts or similar concepts that were, so to speak, imposed on us and have had their validity until now, but are no longer fitting for the path ahead. There too, a lot is being shaken free. To put it very clearly and concisely, it's about setting boundaries and assertiveness, in a nutshell. And for those who are very, very intensely involved in spirituality, this might have a bit of a strange aftertaste because we often want to take the gentler path. We understand the bigger picture, and often assertiveness and setting boundaries are not our first choice. But in this current phase of energy and our own development, these are the components that really want to be brought forward strongly. I already mentioned in the last podcast episode on Sunday that the resistance against what is indeed already takes on a whole new meaning. Even back then, we always said that one should not resist and should let things flow and drift, accepting things as they are. And now something is changing because the resistance to what is also naturally mobilizes a lot of strength, endurance, focus, and activates our ability to change. And in this context, setting boundaries and assertiveness are very, very important topics. I would like to illustrate this with, for example, a comment under my last podcast episode to show a bit more clearly exactly what is meant. For those of you who haven't listened to the podcast yet, you can find it here on YouTube. It's the last video before today's, and in the podcast series, it's naturally the episode before this one. I talked about a topic there. I don't want to completely unravel it again here. But then a listener wrote to me that something is missing, that I had missed some important details in this particular podcast episode. Yes, and what about forgiveness? It was about a perpetrator-victim story, and the listener said, yes, but from a spiritual aspect, what's missing is how the story ends. What about forgiveness? And I just want to specifically address that because in this particular case, especially in this perpetrator-victim example, it's not primarily about forgiveness, but rather about activating a strong ability to set clear boundaries, which clearly puts up a stop sign and also assertiveness, and clearly. This means asserting oneself confidently in such a way that a certain form of justice and fairness or order can emerge in a manner that, and I say this quite broadly on purpose because you can certainly look at what your current issues are, where you need to set boundaries, and where you definitely need to bring order here and there. What do you need to take care of? What needs to be brought into balance? And there are simply different levels. On the purely spiritual level, we can of course work with forgiveness, but that is also a level that does not entirely fall within the realm of the human self. Yes, so when you truly forgive, you will realize there is nothing to forgive. However, if you have to struggle to forgive, if you have to make an incredible effort to forgive, it can easily fall into an aspect of sweeping things under the rug. And on the human level, for example, to connect back to the story I told you in the last episode, it is very, very important that forgiveness can happen eventually, and it will happen naturally. And this doesn't happen because of some spiritual concept, but simply because it happens to the affected individuals and because they are able to forgive as they choose to do so for their own well-being. But first, it is very important that they say stop 1,000 times. And we expect a very, very clear public disclosure here. And that's exactly what the client I told you about did indeed clearly. So she gathered all her courage, controlled all her disgust, and sought a conversation with the perpetrator. And the perpetrator admitted to all his actions. And now she expects him to turn himself in. And he does. And that's super exciting. And she clearly said, you can now decide whether we report you or you report yourself. Of course, he chose voluntary disclosure because he simply assumes that the penalty will be lighter. He also tried to buy his way out, but the customer made it very clear that she wasn't interested in that at all. She wants to create a structure of order here, and it was quite interesting because she told me that normally she is more involved in the alternative field. She usually doesn't have much to do with conventional medicine, but she also doesn't have much to do with our justice system. However, in this case, she feels for the first time that this is exactly what she wants and expects, that the court on a very earthly level takes care of establishing order. She is also aware that the sentence will probably be disappointing, but that's not what it's about for her at all. It's about him clearly facing his actions and exposing himself to this embarrassment, making it really obvious and standing by it. And that from the outside, through the authorities and the justice system within their capabilities, order is simply established. Because the act cannot be undone, it will have no impact on the emotional state of those affected, but it is about order, clarity, setting boundaries, and assertiveness, and significance, and the overall well-being of those involved, and the mental and emotional health of the individuals, and the psychological impact on the people affected. And that is very, very exciting because it fits completely into this energy wave that we are currently dealing with, activating these abilities within us. So where is injustice happening right now? Where has injustice arisen? Where do we want to perhaps distance ourselves from stories, from actions? What can we no longer accept? Where do our spiritual concepts also stand in our way and rather obscure things? Because it's about taking responsibility, that people make mistakes, that happens. But when people consciously make mistakes and repeatedly commit actions, even though they are aware of the wrongdoing, then the task now is to stand by it and take responsibility for it. On the perpetrator level and on the, let's call it the victim level, it is crucial to clearly stand up for oneself, set firm and clear boundaries, and assert oneself confidently and decisively. And of course, this can also mean that now, in the course of our societal structure, in our current society, many things that are unjust and many other things that were clearly and knowingly done unjustly, where it was clear that it was not lawful, such as the entire corona crisis, can be included as an example. That's one example among many. We will certainly see other things where the topics of taking responsibility, setting boundaries, and assertiveness come into play. And this has nothing to do with revenge, but now we can gladly incorporate the spiritual aspect. On the spiritual level, why does this force want to establish itself in us now? Does it have to do with the fact that perhaps stories and dynamics are indeed ultimately coming to a conclusion, and they come to an end when the responsible person takes responsibility, and when the affected person sets boundaries from the story and clearly and explicitly says, I absolutely expect you to take responsibility, and definitively. And then the stories can come to rest, and interestingly, forgiveness can also happen. This can now become a significant and impactful major issue on the societal stage, but also on our very personal stage, in our lives. Yes, and if you are personally affected by this, no matter on what level or which side you belong to, are you perhaps more the perpetrator who needs to take responsibility? Or are you the one who became a victim of an act and expect responsibility to be taken? Then, of course, you have the topic of assertiveness and setting boundaries as a field. And it's also very interesting in this context that the client mentioned she is very, very glad that the perpetrator is indeed making a self-report, because she says she feels it very, very deeply indeed within herself, actually indeed. If they were to publish the ad as a family as a whole, that would be fine, but it would bind them more strongly to the story of 2001 in their entirety. And this issue of setting boundaries doesn't happen as intensely as, well, as she clearly feels is right for her now. And I can totally understand what she means by that. So once again, it's not about revenge, but about balance. It's about equilibrium, where the individual in their own position doesn't initially perceive it as balance, right? Because when you have to set boundaries and assert yourself, you naturally have to put in a lot of energy and might initially feel that it's terribly exhausting, not really your thing at all. Yeah, and you might prefer to just let it slide, turn around and go your own way, and maybe even justify the whole thing with a spiritual concept. But just as much for the perpetrator, yes, it also feels like balance for them to take responsibility now and stand by their actions. So, but at its core, in the end result and at its core, it's ultimately about this balance and about ending injustice and a very, very high transformation of lower vibrations into a higher vibration, fundamentally in essence. And now I come back to the example of the listener who simply said, I lack closure. What about forgiveness? Then it will, in fact, automatically be that peace settles in whenever forgiveness takes place. Indeed, this happens without any intervention. Each individual will naturally still have processes running within themselves regarding these topics. Processes will be brought to the surface, insights will be brought to the surface, and there will be topics that need to be processed even within this entire balance structure. But in principle, everyone can then take care of their own things and get out of this perpetrator-victim dynamic, get out of this blame game, and really look at what to do with their fear or their grief or their anger or their bewilderment, or even with the, yes, consequences that have been left behind, right? Let's move away from the example of the customer and consider a person who has been harmed by the vaccine. So, what kind of damage has been left behind? One has to deal with that, one has to live with it, yes. So if there are consequences you are still suffering from due to a perpetrator-victim dynamic, you will naturally and inevitably have your own processes to accept and ultimately come to terms with them. So, and this is now a wave that is very, very intense, which can definitely come into your life in different ways, and yes, where you should no longer close your eyes, in my opinion, yes. So if you feel that, yes, there are issues in your life that are not resolved, that you accept even though you feel it is wrong, yes, it could be a toxic relationship, it could be violence that you or your children are exposed to, whether emotionally or physically, it could be bullying issues. So no matter where you feel that injustice is happening, it's about, if you are dealing with it, and just by seeing and perceiving it, you have something to do with it, it's about this clarity of setting boundaries. Setting boundaries means that, in my personal opinion, I am indeed fully aware and I do not really agree with it, and I expect you to stop the action and to face the consequences. And ideally, these consequences should be clear and orderly. So not out of sheer anger to take the law into your own hands or to tar and feather someone through the village, but rather to apply the consequences that are appropriate for 2021 and that maintain a certain order. It's a bit strange for me too, but I can totally empathize with it because I think we've all somewhat lost trust in the justice system and institutions in general, or many of us have lost that trust. Yes, and maybe this will lead to a rapprochement again. I don't know, this is just a thought that came to me. I hope the podcast episode gave you something valuable. I'm very curious about your comment. I hope it was okay that I presented it encrypted like this with the client. If you want to dive deeper into it, just listen to the last episode. And otherwise, I would be very happy if you also follow me on Instagram. Join our upcoming live show. There we can work together. It takes place via Zoom. I can also see and hear you there. So it's a very exciting topic, completely free of charge. You just bring your biggest problem with you and we can work on it together. With love, the very best for you, your sister in spirit, your Linda.